Well, it is time for us once again, yet again, to continue our next level on our Jewish journey through the Gospel of John as we make our way verse by verse, word by word, chapter by chapter through this font of riches concerning our Messiah, to make sure that we all are on the same page and that we can proceed together through a new step in the journey. Let us look backwards momentarily and remind ourselves what occurred previously on our Jewish journey through the Gospel of John. All right, well, we have closed the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. That was very suspenseful. The scripture is just as suspenseful as the film, more so. You wonder how long it would have taken him. How long did they stare at an open tomb, waiting for Lazarus to rise from his ledge where he was laid, to come forth from the interior tomb room to the anteroom, and to ascend the stairs? Would they have heard shuffling? Would they have been waiting? Nothing's happening. All of a sudden they see a shadow coming from. Who knows? But it is certainly dramatic, and it certainly puts Yeshua on the final radar of the Jewish leadership. They will not be able to abide what Yeshua has done, and Lazarus as living proof that he has brought forth someone from the dead. It's one thing to heal a congenitally blind man. It's another thing entirely to raise someone who has been dead, not just an hour or two previously or a day and a half, but 4 whole days, after which, of course, the soul has departed according to rabbinic and Jewish teaching. Where there is decomposition, there's no hope of resurrection or resuscitation, and that's exactly what Yeshua has brought. And that's because he is the resurrection and he is the life. We've seen him call out, Elazar, Lazarus, come forth. Indeed, Lazarus does come. This places him in the crosshairs of the Jewish leadership. And Caiaphas, the high priest, says, you do not take into account, speaking to the Jewish leadership, that it is expedient for you that one man, Yeshua, die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. If things get out of hand, the Romans will intervene, and that will be the end of our temple, our nation, our position, and our power. Now, moving forward in the Gospels, chapter 11, the story of Lazarus, that was a hinge. We know that the structure of the Gospel of John is predicated upon the foundation of various different Jewish festivals, most notably several Passovers, and chapter 12, which we will begin today, all the way through to the next to the last chapter, from 12 to 20. That last third of the book takes place within the context. It's where we decompress, if you will, the ministry of Yeshua in that 1 week, that last week, the week of his passion, and that is the week of the Passover. We see exactly how Yeshua fulfills, especially this particular Passover, beginning here in chapter 12. So the hinge is closed. We are now on the other side of this book. Beginning with the end of 11:55. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, as opposed to the Passover of the Italians, the Irish, and the Africans. No, of course, it's the Jewish Passover. John is simply specifying. It sounds weird in English, but it doesn't seem as odd in the original. The Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the countryside, before the Passover to purify themselves. And that's an understatement, because, of course, Passover is one of the pilgrimage festivals. There's only 3 of them in the course of the year. 3 pilgrimage festivals when the Jewish people are commanded throughout Israel and throughout the diaspora, throughout the world, if by any means possible, they are to come to the central location of worship, which is the temple in Jerusalem. And they arrive prior to the onset of Passover in order to make preparation, one of which was to purify themselves from the road, from the normal inconveniences of life, normal life, to prepare their hearts and their bodies to go and enter into the temple for the Passover. And so they come to when I say purify themselves, it simply means to make sure they go into the mikvahs, and there are a multitude of mikvahs, of these immersion pools. You see, they'd go down one side, they'd come up the other, ceremonial clean. These pools are all surrounding the Temple Mount. In fact, this one dates back from Second Temple period. It's right outside on the western end of the Temple Mount structure. You can visit it today. Some of you have been with us and you've seen this very mikvah. So they were seeking for Jesus. Yeshua has become a cause célèbre, which is Hebrew for cause célèbre. And they're seeking for Jesus. He's the big guy now. It's one thing, again, to heal a blind. It's one thing to teach the way, the signs, but to raise someone from the dead. They're seeking for him, for Yeshua. And they were saying to one another, as they stood in the temple, what do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all? He is the major source of gossip in the Jewish community for the week preceding Passover. Now the chief priests and the Pharisees that we've seen what they're up to in the previous passage. They have conspired now. Official. No more spontaneous, we're so irrationally mad that we'll pick up stones and we'll stone him, and then he can escape from our clutches because we had no real plan. Now they have a diabolical plan. The chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, and again, when we talk about chief priests, we're talking about the Sadducees. We're talking about the Sadducees, we're talking about the Jewish aristocracy. We're talking about the Pharisees, we're talking about the most pious of the common folk. And these people, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, they didn't agree on really anything. They were famously at odds with one another theologically and culturally for so many issues. This is one of those extraordinary moments that we see once again that John points out to us, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. These two groups put their animus away temporarily and cooperate on the issue of putting Jesus down, of excising this cancerous tumor from the populace. Chief priest, the Pharisees, given orders that if anyone knew where he was to report it so that they might seize him. So the order has gone out. Every one of the Jewish people who have come to worship at the temple for Passover, this very important and holy time, you've now become a bunch of stoolies. And you are our eyes and our ears. And you're going to snitch and tell us where to find him so that they might seize him. Yeshua, therefore, 6 days before Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead, just in case you've forgotten what you read just a few verses back in the previous chapter. Now, regarding timing, chronology, there are many thoughts regarding the chronology of Holy Week and where the Passover falls, many different ideas and theories. Of course, all but one is incorrect. 6 days before Passover would have been Friday. And so that makes sense because Yeshua winds up, like so many of the pilgrimage coming to Jerusalem for Passover week, winds up traveling and finishing his travels before Shabbat begins on Friday evening. So by Friday afternoon, Yeshua, his disciples, they are staying in Bethany with Lazarus. Now, you'll remember that there aren't that many places for people to stay, to hole up for the week of Passover, not that many inns or hotels, and so everyone opened their homes at Passover time. And again, Lazarus, Mary, Martha, they must have been people of some means, which of course we'll see in the story that unfolds. And certainly they had room within their house, and so they came to Bethany. Now, whether they stayed actually in Lazarus' house, I don't want to tell you more than what the scripture says. It says they came to Bethany. Now, Bethany is the town where Lazarus, where they stayed under his roof. And did Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, brother and sister, did they all live in the same home together? It doesn't say. It's the same community. So let's not draw more than what the scripture says. This, of course, is the road to Bethany. On the left-hand side, you'll see that little hillside with a little tower coming up. Right behind that is Bethany on the way to Jerusalem. In the distance, you see a Mount of Olives as you're looking on the east. And then, of course, in the top left corner is Jerusalem, and right there in the center is Bethany. Today, just on the other side of the Mount of Olives. This is Bethany as it was 130 years ago or so. And of course, this is of course not the tomb of Lazarus, but nonetheless, there could have been a sign that might have been laid in front of the tomb of Lazarus at the time in Bethany. Vacancy. But nonetheless, I don't know whether that was there or not, I don't know. So they made him, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, they made him a supper there. And Martha was serving. But Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. You know that wealthy people, the well-to-do, and of course at Passover, this is not a Seder, this is not Passover, it's the week before, but nonetheless, whether at Passover or through the year when the wealthy through banquets, enjoyed banquets, they reclined, much like this is actually a Greek depiction, but it captures the idea quite well. Small little tables, couches, leaning on one elbow, eating with the other hand, and sitting up kind of. To me, it never winds up being as comfortable as you think it's going to be. But nonetheless, maybe if I got used to it, I could get used to it. But I'll stick with my table and chairs. But this is the way it was. They were reclining. And now it says that Lazarus was one of the ones who was reclining at the table. Now, that would indicate to me that this is actually not happening at Lazarus' home, because it would say Lazarus reclining because he was the host or whatever. And that makes perfect sense because there's another passage. In fact, Matthew and Mark both share the same passage, and they identify the home as being the home of Simon the leper. While he was in Bethany, at the home of Simon the leper, reclining at the table. And the story that Mark tells, and that Matthew follows very closely, is the story that John is going to retell and going to add some important details. So let's just look at the Mark passage before we get into the John passage. He's in Bethany, the home of Simon the leper. Assuming that Simon the leper is not actively a leper at the time, reclining at the table, there came a woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume. Who is the woman? Not identified here. Someone in Bethany. A woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume of pure nard. Now, that's not lard. That's a different substance completely. This is an oil. And she broke the vial and poured it over his head. So, woman in Bethany at dinner while they're reclining at the table, alabaster jar or vial, costly perfume, pure nard, broke the vial, poured it on Yeshua's head. Some, not identified, some people in the room were indignantly remarking to one another, why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. And they were scolding her. But Yeshua said, let her alone. And offered back, in other words, why do you bother her? She has done a good deed to me. For you always have the poor with you, mention of the poor, and whenever you wish, you can do good to them, but you do not always have me. She has done what she could. Here's the identification of what she has done, the significance of what she has done in anointing him. She has anointed my body. Now it said specifically head, but he says body. So it indicates to me that there's more than head, but nonetheless, let's continue. Anointed my body beforehand for the burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her. So what her act of devotion to me will be eternally memorialized. So those are the main points of Mark's telling of the story. Matthew's as well. So now let's look at the story as John tells it. They're at a banquet. Doesn't tell you whose house it is. Could be Simon the leper. This doesn't specify that it's Lazarus' house, so we might as well just say, well, probably Simon the leper, right? That's in accord. No contradiction here. Mary then took, it says a pound. They're trying to make it so that the English readers can see what the equivalent is. It's actually 12 ounces is what this is. 12 ounces of very costly perfume of pure nard, sounds very familiar, and anointed the feet of Jesus. Now that's a divergency there. Anointed the feet of Jesus, and then it gives you more details. She wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So let's unpack that. Let's see what we have here. This, by the way, is the spikenard flower. The oil comes from the root of the spikenard. This is an indigenous Indian plant, very, very costly sort of oil from from the root of the spikenard. Some of you perhaps have purchased a vial of spikenard oil at our Passovers. We usually make them available just so that you can enjoy it. This is an series of alabaster jars, and this as well, little jars from the time of Second Temple Judaism, the time of the Gospels. And this is, I think, more likely the kind of alabaster jar that we were talking about. And again, 12 ounces of spikenard. That is a lot of spikenard. How much spikenard is 12 ounces? Well, this bottle of shampoo is 12 ounces. So what I want you to imagine is taking a bottle of your average bottle of shampoo, 12 fluid ounces. That's precisely what we're looking at here. And I want you to pour it on somebody's head. And if you don't drown them, okay, you're going to have lots left over, okay? And you're going to then move from the head, perhaps to the hands, perhaps then to the feet. So it makes perfect sense that with this excess of spikenard, and it says she broke the top, so she poured out the oil. And so it went on his head, as Mark tells us, and then it went to his feet, as John tells us. Either way, Jesus said, she's anointed my body. He doesn't say anointed my head, doesn't say anointed my feet. She's anointed my body for my burial. Therefore, she's taken this spikenard and she's thoroughly anointed him. Whoops. Well, this, by the way, is Israeli hair from 2,000 years ago. This apparently is authentic hair from Mary, the same locks that wiped up the excess. No, this actually really is 2,000-year-old hair that's been preserved, but it didn't come with a note that said from Miriam and preserved in spikenard and like that, just so you'd see the idea of hair, the locks, and being able to wipe it up. But Judas Iscariot, now we've met him before, one of the disciples who was intending to betray him, Yeshua, he's got a problem. Now, Mark, the story he told, said some were indignant. John gets very specific. It was Judas specifically who became indignant. And he said, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people? He wants to know, why has it been wasted on the head and the feet of the rabbi instead of sold and money distributed? This, by the way, is a denarii from that time, the image of Caesar on the front. This represents a working man's wage for one day. So 300, then when you take away the holidays, when you take away Shabbat, 300 denarii represents an annual salary for an average Joe. She just blew the average salary of an average Joe in 10 minutes on your feet and on your hair. Think about how much more good we could have done with that money. These are shekels, 75 shekels, roughly Tyrian shekels, or basically 300 denarii, an equivalent, 4 to 1. And so this is what that amount of money would have looked like in the time of Yeshua. Think about that amount of cash. What kind of ministry could we have accomplished? Talk about benevolence. How benevolent we could have been with a year's worth of salary. Instead of literally poured out and wiped away on her hair and on your feet. Remember, we met Judas back in the end of chapter 6. And Jesus answered them, did I myself not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? Now he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, Shimon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him. This is a little foreshadowing, but it has been now 6 chapters. We haven't heard anything about this betrayal. There was just a little foreshadowing 6 chapters earlier, and several months for us. And now we see Judas, the betrayer, again. But it's very, very important to remember that Jesus has identified that the underlying force behind the betrayal of Judas, the motivating force behind Judas, is Satan, is the devil. Now, getting back to the story, now he, Judas, said this, not because he had a bleeding heart, not because he had a real heart for the poor, not because he had a real heart for ministry. He said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put in. He carried their sack of coins, which was replenished by supporters over the period of their ministry. Sometimes there'd be a crowd of family, a grateful worshiper who would be very happy to contribute to the ministry. And Judas was the one who collected those coins, and apparently he was pilfering for himself. The coins, really tiny, like dime size, so very easy to separate, to palm off, and you would barely miss a few if somebody were to embezzle a little bit of the ministry funding. So nothing noble about Judas. I always liked Judas in the movies about Jesus. Not like this one, which is just word for word, the gospel, but the movies like Jesus Christ Superstar, or like Jesus of Nazareth, they try to create some kind of noble, dramatic tension between the idealistic Judas who is disillusioned and why he winds up betraying Jesus and does for Jesus. John puts the kibosh on that kind of dramatic license. There's nothing noble about Judas. The only thing noble about Judas is that Yeshua specifically picked him for the purpose of being his disciple. Therefore Jesus said, let her alone, that she may keep it, and this is difficult Greek, she may keep it for the day of my burial. She did this for the day. It's very difficult to translate this, and there's a lot of disagreement. But this translation is just as good as any other. She may keep it for the day of my burial, for you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. It's very similar to what he said in Mark and in Matthew. The poor you always have with you. You have the poor always, but you don't always have me, and the time is getting short. Jesus is quoting a passage from Deuteronomy 15. It's a very famous passage. It would have been the benevolence passage of the day, of the time, if you will. Deuteronomy 15:11, for the poor will never cease to be in the land. So since you're always going to have the poor with you, as Jesus alludes to, therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to the needy and the poor in your land. Since poverty is going to be a constant, make sure that charity, or tzedakah, right, righteous giving, is always part of your regime as well. And that would have been the standard idea. Yeshua is actually saying part of this is true. Yes, poor you'll always have with you. But there's an exception. There's a deviation to the rest of the statement here, because these are interesting times in which we live, he says. These are unique times. And right now, your concern is not to be what will always be, but what is only novel right now, and that is my presence in your midst. And so everything is suspended while you have me with you. The poor you'll have with you always, but me, not so much. A large crowd of the Jews then learned he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only. This is interesting. Now it gets really thick. They came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. Lazarus, you see now, is a bit of a sideshow. Come to Bethany. See the amazing Lazarus, who has been raised from the dead. Will he stink of the grave? But from beyond the grave he came. But he's wearing normal clothes. Can you tell that he was dead and is now alive? Anyway, they're curious. He's a curiosity. People are the same 2,000 years ago they are now. They gossip, they're curious, and they want to gawk. And so they want to see not only Jesus, but they want to see the curiosity of Lazarus. The crowds who were there for Passover come and make their way just less than 2 miles away to Bethany to see what's going on. But the chief priests, we've seen their plan. The chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also. It's very interesting. Now, we never hear of how this plan proceeds and whether this goes through or not. Church tradition tells us it didn't. But nonetheless, this was part of the plan, it was a corollary to the plot to destroy Yeshua, to also put Lazarus to death. Because on account of him, on account of Lazarus, many of the Jews were going away. Away from whom? From the authority, recognizing the authority of the Jewish leadership, and they were believing in Jesus. They were joining the other team. So the leaders of the Jewish people were going to sacrifice Yeshua and this Exhibit A, Lazarus, as a way of protecting the people from their own foolishness. Because again, leaders always know best. On account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. And that brings us to the end of this passage. The next verse, it's going to be the triumphal entry, and we have to focus on that next time. So let's pause now. We've covered just a really short story, a short piece of information, but yet information that is critical for us to be able to move forward in the story that John is telling. What is critical about what we've seen? We've seen the devotion of a disciple of Yeshua taking an item of I won't say inestimable because it estimated a year wages, but of extraordinary value and worth, this alabaster jar of spikenard. She pours it on the head of Yeshua. There's more to pour. She pours the remainder on his feet. And you say, well, when you anoint somebody with costly perfume and oil, why would you wipe it? She takes her hair and she wipes it off. It's a very, first of all, to anoint somebody's feet like that, that is to wash them, it's what a servant does. So not a hostess, not the hostess with the mostess. But she really marries the hostess with the mostess here. She takes her hair. But why is she wiping it? She just poured it out. Why wipe it away? Some might think, well, she's not wiping it off. She's rubbing it in. But if you think, again, back to the shampoo, if you take a thick, viscous substance, perhaps not as thick as shampoo, and you pour it on someone's hair, and then you pour it around their feet or on their feet, then there's just so much. It was such a liberal application. You can't leave that as it is, or it becomes, first of all, hazardous, but second of all, it's kind of messy. And so she performs an act of devotion, a costly act of devotion, and then cleans up after herself. So sometimes people have acts of devotion that begin so well and so extraordinary. And you say, look, what a ministry we have. And it's like when everything's over, it's like a bomb went off. But she cleans up. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to the devotion she lavishes on Yeshua. And while others in the room, specifically Judas, want to spank her, criticize her for what they consider to be an extraordinary lavish waste of money and effort, Yeshua says, you don't know what you're talking about. Because what she's done is she has anointed my body for burial. Anointed your body for burial. Again, what a downer. What are you talking about? This is really for the first time. We've seen hints. My hour is not yet come, things like this. But we haven't really seen in the John, we haven't seen Yeshua speak of his impending death. And at this point, it becomes very clear that we are moving, we're accelerating exponentially, faster and faster, and before you know it, Yeshua will be dead. And if the great rabbi, if the one who was sent by God, from God, the one who came into the world to be light and life, if he dies, is that the end of the whole enterprise? What happens from this point? We know that he's anointed for his body is anointed for his burial. But what is the significance of Yeshua's death? And how quickly will it come in the narrative? And what is it that Yeshua is saying in praising Mary for this act of devotion? Is it appropriate for a woman to worship a man with the attention, devotion that she lavishes on Yeshua? Jesus says, absolutely. So now as we move toward our time of communion, I want you to put yourselves in the position of the guests at that event, at that banquet. Who would you be? Here's a scenario. Yeshua, right? Nobody gets to play Yeshua. He plays himself. Right? Let's say Yeshua's in the room. Somebody needs to play Mary. Somebody needs to play Judas. Somebody needs to play some of the other people in the Lazarus, etc. Who would you be in the story? Would you be the person saying, I have the most costly item in my... It's not like at that point people had like bric-a-brac and knickknacks and all kinds of things on shelves where, look at this costly item and look at that costly item and look at... No. This was like the costly item that she had. She pulls it off the shelf or off the ledge. And she takes the most costly thing that she has, this nard, this spikenard, this super perfume. 12 ounces of it. It's an elaborate amount. One would say ungodly amount, except it becomes a very godly amount. And in one act of devotion, she says, I'm spending it all on you, Yeshua, on an act of devotion, which might have lasted 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. How long does it take to anoint somebody's head and feet? And wipe it up with your hair. And then it's over. Or would you be Judas? Not the thieving, pilfering type of Judas, but saying, prospective people, you just blew a budget of a year when there's ministry to be done. Who would you be? You don't have to think very hard and think back 2,000 years, because the lives we live illustrate these truths. Every day, we get to make the decision, do we concentrate on Yeshua, or is Yeshua kind of an also-ran to the ministry that we're doing? What's more important, the ministry that we're involved in and helping people, praying for people, ministering to them, or our worship of Yeshua? Worshiping Yeshua, how unproductive to sit there at his feet, pouring out perfume, rub-a-dub-dub with your hair. Every day, we have the opportunity to decide, will we sit at the feet of Yeshua? Will we lavish him with attention? Or will we be distracted by working in his name? And it's a genuine conundrum, especially for those who are in the ministry, professional ministry, because there's so many good things that we can be about, but we can forget to sit at the feet of Jesus, to worship him, to lavish him with praise. He's not just a great rabbi. He's the Son of God, worthy of our praise, worthy of our devotion. And if we could pick one thing, I want you to think in your home right now, what is the thing of greatest value to you? Is it your 65-inch television with the OLED? Is it your car, your Lexus, your Mercedes? Is the thing of value, the thing that you value the most, is it your awesome MacBook, your computer? Is it your phenomenally expensive and luxurious mattress and bed that you get to curl up? Is it the redone bathroom and tile and flooring in your home? What is the thing that you consider of greatest value in your home? Intellectually speaking, no contest. Jesus is way more important, right? But practically speaking, how do you live when you live your life in a when we did our bathroom 10 years ago, whatever it was, I would walk in there and, wow, this is so awesome. You know, and and the shower that I took, I was so clever because I took out the diverter, you know, so it's got super pressure, and I put it in myself, and I thought, my shower, and the lighting, and the tile, and this new room. And I spent more time luxuriating in the new doodads we did to our home than I did luxuriating in the presence of Jesus. I'll get to you, Jesus, because I gotta enjoy my shower, or I gotta enjoy my 65-inch television, because it's so captivating, it's so mesmerizing. Or I so enjoy driving around in my Lexus. Oh, what a pleasure it is. right? Look at what this thing can do. And, oh, can you hear anything? Of course you don't, because that's how quiet the engine is in my car. She had one jar of alabaster, an alabaster jar of spikenard. She poured it all out on Yeshua. I want you to think today, whatever the one thing of value is that you have. I'm not telling anybody don't enjoy what you have. God gives, and we should enjoy his blessings. But would you give that item to Yeshua? Would you tell Yeshua how much more, right now, how much more important he is than anything else in your life? Any other person. This is the hardest thing of all. My son was born. Some of us feel this way. Every parent feels this way. Your child is born. Is there anything as precious? Is there anything as beautiful? Is there anything as magnificent as your baby? Yeah, Jesus. Right? And as a parent, I know that sometimes it's a close call between the emotion you feel and the connection you feel to your baby, which is normal and natural, and the connection, the emotion, the affection that you feel toward the creator and sustainer of the universe, right? By the time they hit puberty, it's no contest anymore. It's back to God, easy. But there's a period of time, right? And so I want you to think, is there anything in your life that is more important to you than the Lord? And if there is, then as we take the communion today, as we participate in the bread and the juice, I want you to pour that item out, metaphysically, figuratively speaking, metaphorically. Pour it out and worship at the feet of Yeshua. Let's